I never imagined I'd live on a street like Maplewood Lane. It's the kind of place you see in postcards. Big trees shading the sidewalks, lawns so green they look fake, and houses with white picket fences that scream perfect family life. When my wife, Claire, and I first drove down this street 5 years ago, it felt like we'd hit the jackpot. The kids' school was just around the corner, the neighbors waved hello, and everything seemed picture perfect. But nothing stays perfect forever. That's something I learned the hard way. It all started with a piece of paper. One day, I opened the front door to find an envelope lying on the doormat. Inside was a letter from the Homeowners Association, or HOA, as everyone calls them. At first glance, it looked harmless enough, a friendly reminder about keeping up with neighborhood standards. But when I flipped to the second page, my stomach sank. There were pages and pages of rules. Rules about how high your grass could grow. Rules about what color flowers you could plant. Rules about where you could park your car. It felt like someone had written a rulebook for living. The worst part, they fined us $50 because our rose bushes were too wild. Too wild. Have you ever heard anything so ridiculous? Those roses weren't hurting anyone. In fact, they were one of the things that made our house feel like home. But apparently, according to the HOA, they didn't fit their idea of neighborhood charm. At first, I laughed it off. Who cares about a silly fine? But then I noticed other people getting letters too. Tom, the retired teacher next door, got dinged for hanging wind chimes outside his window. Elena across the street got a warning because her bright yellow front door didn't match the HOA-approved paint colors. It was like no one was safe. That's when I realized this wasn't just about rules or fines. This was about control. Someone, or some group of people, wanted to tell us how to live our lives. They wanted to decide what our homes should look like, what sounds we could hear, even what colors we could see when we stepped outside. And if we didn't follow their rules, they'd punish us. Claire tried to calm me down. "It's not that big a deal," she said one evening while we sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Just trim the bushes and move on." But I couldn't let it go. Every time I looked at those roses, I thought about how unfair it was. Why should someone else get to decide what makes our house special? What gave them the right to take away something that brought us joy? As the days went by, I started paying closer attention to the HOA. I read through their newsletters, attended meetings, and talked to other neighbors. Some of them shrugged it off, saying it was easier to just follow the rules. Others whispered complaints but were too scared to say anything out loud. A few, though, felt the same way I did. They were tired of being told what to do, tired of feeling like they didn't belong in their own homes. And that's when I knew something had to change. Claire insisted we go to the next HOA meeting. "We'll explain ourselves," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They're reasonable people. They'll understand." I wasn't so sure. By this point, I'd already spent hours stewing over the rosebush fine. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. How could anyone call our roses a problem? They weren't just plants. They were memories. Claire and I had planted them together the summer we moved in. We'd laughed as we dug holes in the dirt, argued over which spot would get the most sun, and celebrated when the first blooms appeared. Those roses were part of our story, and now some stranger wanted to tell us they didn't belong. Still, Claire was right about one thing. Sitting at home and complaining wouldn't fix anything. So on a Tuesday evening, we walked into the community clubhouse for the monthly HOA meeting. The room smelled like stale coffee and old carpet. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making everyone look pale and tired. A long table stretched across the front of the room, where a group of people sat with clipboards and folders. At the center of the table was Margaret Hensley, the head of the HOA. Margaret was hard to miss. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her blazer looked like it cost more than my car. She held herself like she owned the place, which, in a way, she kind of did. As she scanned the room, her eyes landed on me for a split second before moving on. Something about the way she carried herself made my skin crawl. She wasn't just confident, she was intimidating. When it was time for residents to speak, I stood up reluctantly. My heart pounded as I cleared my throat. "Hi," I started, gripping the edge of the podium. "My name's Alex, and I live at 12 Maplewood Lane. I want to talk about the rule regarding landscaping." Margaret leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. "Go on," she said coolly. "Well," I continued, trying to sound calm, "we got fined for having wild rose bushes in our yard. But those bushes mean something to us. They're not hurting anyone, and they don't take away from the neighborhood. If anything, they add character." For a moment, there was silence. Then Margaret spoke. "Character is subjective," she said sharply. "Rules exist to maintain consistency. Without them, this neighborhood would lose its appeal." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Appeal. Was that all this was about? Making sure every house looked exactly the same. I glanced around the room, hoping someone else would jump in and support me, but most people avoided eye contact. A few nodded along with Margaret, while others stared at their laps, pretending not to listen. As I sat back down, I felt defeated. Maybe Claire was right. Maybe these people couldn't be reasoned with. But then I noticed something. Across the room, Tom, the retired teacher, gave me a small nod. Helena, the single mom with the yellow door, scribbled something on a piece of paper and slid it toward me. It read, "You're not alone." That tiny gesture changed everything. For the first time since the whole rosebush fiasco began, I felt a flicker of hope. If we stuck together, maybe we could push back against the HOA's iron grip. Maybe we could remind them, and ourselves, that homes are supposed to reflect who we are, not who someone else wants us to be. By the end of the meeting, I knew what I had to do. This wasn't just about my roses anymore. It was about standing up for the soul of our neighborhood. And I wasn't going to back down without a fight. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Margaret sitting at the head of the table, her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line, kept replaying in my mind. Her words echoed too. Rules exist to maintain consistency. Consistency. Was that really all she cared about? What about personality, creativity, freedom? It felt like she wanted to turn our neighborhood into some soulless showroom where every house was identical, every lawn perfectly manicured, and every person afraid to step out of line. I tossed and turned for hours before finally giving up on sleep. Padding downstairs in the dark, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the shadowy outlines of our rose bushes. Claire had already trimmed them earlier that week, cutting back the wilder branches to make them look more acceptable. Even in the dim light, they still looked beautiful to me. But now they felt smaller, tamer, less alive. Like they'd been forced to shrink themselves to fit someone else's idea of perfection. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go. Not anymore. But I also knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. If we were going to stand up to the HOA, we needed allies, people who felt the same frustration and were willing to do something about it. The next day, I started reaching out. First, I knocked on Tom's door. He was outside watering his plants when I approached him, holding a cup of coffee as a peace offering. "Morning," I said with a smile. "Mind if I join you?" Tom shrugged but nodded toward the chair on his porch. As we sipped our drinks, I brought up the meeting. "What did you think of Margaret's little speech?" I asked casually. Tom sighed, shaking his head. "Honestly, I'm tired of it. Last month, they told me to take down my wind chimes because they were too noisy." Too noisy. They're wind chimes. It's not like they're blasting music at midnight. His frustration mirrored mine, and I could tell he was ready to push back. "What if we teamed up?" I suggested carefully. "We can't be the only ones who feel this way." He thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Count me in." Encouraged, I moved on to Elena. She answered the door with her young son clinging to her leg, his toy car clutched tightly in one hand. "Hey, Alex," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Everything okay?" "I was wondering if we could talk," I replied. "About the HOA." Her expression shifted instantly. "Oh." She glanced down at her son, then stepped out onto the porch, closing the door slightly behind her. "Look, I know what you're thinking. That yellow door thing was ridiculous, but I don't want to cause trouble." "You're not causing trouble," I assured her. "You're standing up for yourself. For all of us. And you're not alone. I've already talked to Tom. We can figure this out together." After a long pause, Elena nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "but we have to be smart about it. No burning bridges." By the end of the week, we had a small group of neighbors ready to take action. There was Tom with his wind chimes, Elena with her bold yellow door, and even Greg, a soft-spoken guy whose garage basketball hoop had earned him a warning because it was visually unappealing. Together, we called ourselves the Maplewood Defenders, a name that made us laugh, but also gave us a sense of purpose. Our plan was simple: challenge the most unreasonable rules one by one. We wouldn't break them outright. That would give the HOA too much ammunition, but we find ways to test their limits. Maybe Tom would hang his wind chimes again, claiming they were temporary decorations. Maybe Elena would repaint her door an even brighter shade of yellow. And maybe I'd let those rose bushes grow just a little wilder than the HOA liked. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was about reminding ourselves, and the HOA, that our homes weren't just houses. They were reflections of who we were. And no rulebook could change that. Still, as I stood in my driveway later that evening, looking at the growing shadows cast by the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing with fire. The HOA wasn't going to back down easily, and once we started pushing, there'd be no turning back. Things escalated faster than any of us expected. One Saturday morning, I woke up to find flyers plastered on every lamppost along Maplewood Lane. The bold red letters practically screamed, "Enforce all rules immediately." At the bottom, in smaller print, was Margaret's signature. It didn't take a genius to figure out what this meant. Word about our little group, the Maplewood Defenders, had gotten out, and the HOA wasn't happy. At first, it felt almost comical. Flyers? Really? But then came the inspections. Every week, members of the HOA board would drive through the neighborhood in their shiny SUVs, armed with clipboards and cameras. They'd stop in front of houses, snap photos, and jot down notes like detectives hunting for clues. Nothing escaped their attention, not the slightly crooked shutters, not the patch of weeds poking through sidewalk cracks, and certainly not my roses, which had grown back just a little wilder than before. Fines started piling up faster than we could pay them off. Tom got hit again for his wind chimes, even though he'd moved them to the backyard where no one could see them. Elena received another warning because her yellow door supposedly distracted from the aesthetic harmony of the street. Greg's basketball hoop earned him yet another notice, this time for being too tall. It was like they were trying to crush us under a mountain of paperwork and penalties. But the worst part wasn't the money. It was the fear. Neighbors who had once waved hello stopped talking altogether. People hurried past each other on the sidewalks, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Kids who used to ride bikes together now played indoors, glued to screens instead of laughing outside. Even the trees seemed quieter, their leaves rustling nervously in the breeze. The neighborhood that had once felt so alive now felt suffocating, like everyone was walking on eggshells. One evening, as I watered the rose bushes, I couldn't help myself. They needed care. Elena approached me. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. "Alex," she whispered, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." "What do you mean?" I asked, lowering the hose. "This, fighting back," she said, gesturing vaguely at her house. "What if we go too far? What if they start targeting us even more?" Her words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. Deep down, I'd been asking myself the same question. Where exactly was the line between standing up for ourselves and tearing apart the fabric of our community? Were we helping or making things worse? Before I could answer, Tom walked over, holding a fresh flyer he'd pulled off his mailbox. His face was grim. "They're calling an emergency meeting tomorrow," he said. "Margaret's hosting it. Something about urgent matters concerning property values." The three of us exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It was war. And we were outnumbered. That night, I sat on the porch with Claire, staring at the darkened street. "Do you think we should stop?" she asked softly. "Maybe we're pushing too hard." I wanted to tell her no, that we couldn't give up now. But the truth was, I wasn't sure. Fighting back had given us a sense of purpose, but it had also turned our peaceful neighborhood into a battleground. Was it worth it? Or were we losing sight of why we started this in the first place? As I leaned back in my chair, listening to the distant hum of cicadas, I realized something. The HOA wasn't just testing our resolve, they were testing our unity. If we cracked now, they'd win. But if we stuck together, well, maybe there was still hope. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were yet to come. This expanded version builds tension by showing the growing pressure from the HOA and its impact on the community. It introduces doubt and internal conflict while keeping readers engaged with relatable emotions and vivid imagery. Let me know if you'd like further tweaks. The emergency meeting was scheduled for a sweltering July afternoon, and by the time I arrived at the clubhouse, my shirt was already sticking to my back. The air inside was no better, stale and heavy, with the faint smell of lemon-scented cleaner that did nothing to mask the tension in the room. Every seat was taken, and the hum of whispered conversations filled the space like static electricity before a storm. Margaret stood at the front, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. Her usual composed demeanor seemed to crack under the weight of whatever she was about to say. She looked around the room, her eyes scanning each face as if trying to gauge who was on her side and who wasn't. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp, cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "Some residents," she began, her tone dripping with disdain, "seem determined to destroy everything we've worked so hard to build here. If these violations continue, drastic measures will be taken." Drastic measures. My stomach churned. What exactly did that mean? Was she talking about fines, lawsuits, eviction notices? The phrase hung in the air like a threat, unspoken but clear. As I glanced around the room, I saw panic flicker in the eyes of my fellow rebels. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Alina clutched her purse like it might somehow protect her. Even Greg, usually so quiet, looked pale and uneasy. When the meeting ended, I walked out into the oppressive heat, my mind racing. Claire was waiting for me in the car, and the moment I got in, she turned to me. "Well," she asked, her voice tight with worry. "What happened?" I told her everything, or at least as much as I could before the frustration bubbled over. "She's not backing down," I said, gripping the steering wheel. "In fact, she's doubling down. And now she's threatening drastic measures. Whatever that means." Claire sighed, rubbing her temples. "Is it worth it, Alex? For a few flowers? For pride? We can't keep fighting this forever." Her words stung because they hit too close to home. Was I being stubborn? Selfish even? Maybe she was right. Maybe this fight wasn't worth the toll it was taking on our family and our neighborhood. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that giving up would mean losing something far more important than roses or wind chimes. It would mean letting someone else decide how we lived our lives. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the meeting in my head. Margaret's cold glare haunted me, but so did Claire's question. Is it worth it? I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing. I couldn't face this alone anymore. If we were going to win, or at least survive, we needed to talk to Margaret directly. Not as enemies, but as people. The next morning, I called her. "Margaret," I said when she answered, "we need to meet. Just you and me. No board members, no clipboards, just a conversation." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, she sighed. "Fine. Tomorrow morning. At the park." When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of dread and hope. Dread because I had no idea what she'd say or do. Hope because maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to fix this without destroying everything we built. As I stepped outside to water the roses one last time before the meeting, I noticed something unexpected. Neighbors were starting to trickle out of their houses again, walking dogs, chatting on porches, kids riding bikes down the street. It wasn't perfect, but it was life. And suddenly, I realized that's what this fight was really about. Not rules or fines, but life. Real, messy, beautiful life. Tomorrow's meeting wouldn't be easy, but I was ready. The park was quiet the next morning. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. The rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant chirping of birds, the soft crunch of gravel beneath your shoes. I arrived early, partly to gather my thoughts, and partly because I didn't want Margaret to think I was late on purpose. She was already there, sitting on a bench near the duck pond, her clipboard resting on her lap like a shield. As I approached, she looked up but didn't smile. "You're punctual," she said, her tone neutral. "I'll give you that." "Thanks," I replied, taking a seat beside her. There was an awkward pause as we both stared out at the water, where a family of ducks paddled lazily in circles. For a moment, it felt less like a negotiation and more like two strangers waiting for a bus. Finally, I broke the silence. "Margaret, I need to say something, and I want you to hear me out." She raised an eyebrow, but nodded slightly, signaling me to continue. "I get it," I started, choosing my words carefully. "You care about this neighborhood. You want it to look nice, to feel welcoming, to maintain its value. But here's the thing. It's not just a neighborhood. It's our home. And when you enforce these rules so strictly, it feels like you're taking away what makes it special. Like you're turning it into, I don't know, some kind of showroom instead of a place where people live." Her expression didn't change, but I noticed her grip on the clipboard loosen ever so slightly. Encouraged, I went on. "Take my roses, for example. They're not hurting anyone. They're part of who we are. Or Tom's wind chimes. They're not noise pollution. They're memories of his late wife. These little things matter to us. And when you take them away, it feels like you're taking away pieces of ourselves." For a long time, Margaret didn't respond. She stared at the ducks, her face unreadable. Then finally, she sighed. A deep, weary sigh that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than annoyance or frustration. "Do you know why I do this?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. I shook my head. "No, I don't." She hesitated, then spoke again, her voice softer now. "Because I'm scared. Scared of what happens if we let go. If everyone does whatever they want, where does it end? Chaos. People complaining that their property values have dropped because someone painted their house neon green. Kids running wild because no one enforces curfews. This neighborhood means something to me too, Alex. Maybe not in the same way it does to you, but it still matters. And I don't want to lose that." Her honesty caught me off guard. Up until now, I'd seen her as the villain in this story. The rigid rule enforcer who cared more about appearances than people. But sitting there, listening to her talk, I realized she wasn't evil. She was just afraid. Afraid of losing control, of watching everything she'd worked for slip through her fingers. "You're right," I admitted after a moment. "We all care about this place. But maybe there's a middle ground. A way to keep the neighborhood looking good without suffocating everyone in the process." Margaret considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. "What are you proposing?" I took a deep breath. "Let's relax some of the stricter rules, like the ones about flower colors or wind chimes. And in return, we'll agree to follow the bigger ones, like keeping lawns mowed and driveways clear. We'll work together instead of against each other. She studied me for a long moment, weighing my words. Then, slowly, she nodded. Fine. But if things get out of hand, we revisit this conversation. Deal, I said, extending my hand. She hesitated before shaking it, her grip firm but reluctant. As we stood up to leave, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. This wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't even close, but it was a start. For the first time in months, it felt like we were moving forward instead of digging ourselves deeper into a hole. Walking back home, I passed Elena watering her yellow door, which she'd repainted even brighter than before. She gave me a questioning look, and I smiled. It's okay, I told her. We're going to be all right. She grinned, relief washing over her face, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it too. Months later, Maplewood Lane looked different. Not perfect, but alive. The once uniform rows of houses now had a personality all their own. Bright yellow doors coexisted with pastel blues and greens. Wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze, adding music to the air. And yes, my roses bloomed proudly in the front yard, slightly wild but undeniably beautiful. It wasn't chaos, it was balance. But just when I thought we'd finally found peace, something unexpected happened. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled across the driveway, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel behind our property line. Curious, and honestly, a little irritated, I grabbed my thermos of coffee and walked toward the sound. What I saw made my blood boil. Two men wearing neon vests emblazoned with HOA Patrol stood near the edge of my ranchland, snapping photos and jotting notes on clipboards. My ranchland, land that wasn't part of the HOA jurisdiction. Not technically, anyway. Excuse me, I shouted, striding toward them. What do you think you're doing? One of them turned, startled. Sir, we're conducting routine inspections. This is private property, I interrupted, jabbing a finger toward the ground. You're trespassing. Get off my land. The two exchanged uneasy glances before retreating to their vehicle. As they drove away, I felt a mix of triumph and unease. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Back inside, I picked up the phone and dialed Margaret's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. Alex, is everything okay? Margaret, I said firmly, we need to talk. Again. There was a pause, then a sigh. What happened? I explained what I'd seen. The so-called HOA Patrol snooping around land that didn't belong to the association. This wasn't part of the agreement, I added. If this keeps happening, we're going to have bigger problems than flower colors. To her credit, Margaret sounded genuinely surprised. I didn't authorize this, she said quickly. Let me look into it. By the end of the week, she called me back. It seems there was a misunderstanding, she admitted reluctantly. Some members of the board thought they could expand inspections beyond HOA boundaries. It won't happen again. Her apology felt sincere, but it left me wondering how far the HOA would go if no one pushed back. This latest incident reminded me that while we'd made progress, the fight for freedom and fairness was never truly over. Still, as I stood on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet sense of pride. Maplewood Lane wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Our homes reflected who we were, quirks and all. The neighborhood had become a tapestry of individuality woven together by shared effort and compromise. Claire joined me on the porch, handing me a mug of hot cocoa. You did good, she said softly, leaning against me. We all did. I smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Yeah, we did. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, I realized something important. Life isn't about following rules blindly or fighting endlessly. It's about finding a way to live together, despite our differences, and creating something meaningful along the way. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what we'd done.